We are back, and we are joined now by Chip Gibbons, Policy Director of Defending Rights and Dissent, contributor to Jacobin, here to talk about the state of free speech in the Trump era, specifically with Gaza and Mahmoud Khalil and more. Chip, thanks so much for coming on the show today.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, you've been updating people on defending rights and dissent on it's called Gaza First Amendment Alert. You're doing this on a weekly basis, kind of collecting all of the egregious free speech violations under the Trump administration as it relates to speech on Gaza in particular. But, obviously there is a war on free speech on multiple fronts. I mean, we could talk about the CBS thing for a while, but let's just stick to the Gaza stuff for now. The Zoran Mamdani, this victory, the fact that it's sending such like panic throughout Washington is hilarious to me on one side, but then you have things like, as you wrote about in your latest First Amendment alert, Representative Andy Ogles calling for him to be deported. Donald Trump talking about Zoran Mamdani being deported. Just speak about that case a bit and how dangerous it is to be speaking about deporting somebody based on their political speech.
Well, I have to thank my colleague, Nathan Fuller. He's the one who wrote that article for the Gaza First Amendment Alert. He did a really good job. But no, the Mamdani calls for deportation are part of a larger trend that we've seen. It isn't just Trump. It goes back to Hoover and the Palmer raids, when we would use sort of immigration law as a tool for political policing. It's very disturbing to see somebody obviously defending rights and dissent as a C3 is nonpartisan. We have no position on the election, but it is disturbing to see someone win a Democratic victory, and the response of people who are unhappy with what the voters have done is to try to deport that person, denaturalize them, expel them. And the various things they're bringing up as grounds for deportation, he was in DSA or is in DSA. I mean, that's straight out the Red Scare, both of them. Or that he had a rap song where he said, "Give my love to the Holy Land Five." I think that's the impermissible line. The Holy Land Five were 5 Muslim Americans who were ridiculously persecuted for providing aid to the people of Gaza, the Palestinian people of Gaza. And the U.S. government has this theory of terrorism. Per the U.S. government in the prosecution, they said Hamas had 3 parts to it: a military wing, and of course that military wing engages in acts outside of international humanitarian law that I condemn, a political wing, a social wing. And if you give money to charity, to help orphans, to help hospitals, to help feed people, and that charity goes through a Hamas-controlled charity network or charity committee, you are guilty of material support for terrorism, and we will put you in prison. The U.S. government never alleged the Holy Land Five bought guns. They never alleged they were involved in violence. They were literally accused of helping orphans and funding hospitals on the grounds that those were Hamas hospitals, Hamas protected orphans. And of course, today Israel bombs hospitals using that same logic that the U.S. government introduced in this case, in part through Israeli intelligence. And every single civil liberties group, every single human rights group, every single group that just gives humanitarian aid overseas that I know of oppose that prosecution, because it is such an affront to the First Amendment. It is such an affront to humanitarian aid, and it is such an affront to basic human decency. And, if you say, okay, give my love to these 5 political prisoners convicted of humanitarian aid, you have to be denaturalized and deported. That's material support for terrorism. So I think it's always disturbing to see immigration law used in a political context, although political policing is arguably the original purpose of U.S. immigration law going back to John Adams and certainly going back to J. Edgar Hoover. But it is even more concerning when, the crime is basic support for Palestinian rights, basic support for political prisoners, and basic free speech. So this is an incredibly disturbing case. It is deeply rooted in the American tradition. I wrote a piece for Jacobin called "Crushing Dissent Through Immigration Law," which predates this, that looked at sort of the Palmer raids, the attacks on Harry Bridges, a famous labor leader, the Los Angeles 8, similar to Mahmoud Khalil, Palestinians. And it's just a long trend. And the Trump administration is able to tap into the worst parts of the American national security apparatus in order to carry out its war on free speech. And it's worth pointing out, we didn't start the Gaza First Amendment alert under Trump. We started it under Biden.
Yes,
and we did so because we said we are enduring the worst crisis for civil liberties since the war on terror. Now, Trump looked at that and said, let's go back to McCarthyism. Let's go back to the Palmer raids. So I no longer say it can't get worse because they always prove to me in Washington it can. But, so we were in a war on terror like situation, and we are rapidly devolving into a Palmer raids type situation.
Well, if you don't mind expanding on the Palmer raids, because I think a lot of our audience is familiar with the parallels to the Red Scare. I mean, you'd have to be blind not to see the parallels there. But the Palmer raids, and there's also a lot of discussion about historical parallels. There were many to the Vietnam War and the lead up to the 2024 race, but there are a lot of parallels to the Gilded Age and pre-Great Depression time periods. Talk a little bit about that period of history and, Herbert Hoover's racism as well, and how he used the Palmer raids and immigration for similar ends.
Sure. So the Palmer raids are part of what's called the First Red Scare. The U.S. historians generally divide the Red Scares into two categories. The first Red Scare, which happened under Woodrow Wilson after World War I, of which the Palmer raids were a huge part of. And the second Red Scare is what's generally called McCarthyism. There's a very famous quote from Ellen Schresker, the leading historian of McCarthyism, that if we knew then what we know, we'd call it Hooverism. And J. Edgar Hoover is the driving force in both Red Scares. The Palmer raids are named after the Attorney General Palmer. They are the brainchild of J. Edgar Hoover, who at this point heads a division within the nascent FBI called originally the Radical Division. Why is there a Radical Division? It wasn't because they were radical. They were policing radicals. And then it becomes General Intelligence Division. And Hoover is really into using intelligence to spy on political speech. Some of the tasks he was given was to prove the Wobblies and the Soviet Unions were behind the fact that Black people were fighting back to lynch mobs, because why else would you fight back to a lynch mob unless Lenin or the IWW told you to? Real galaxy brain thinking going on in the U.S. government.
Why would you protest a genocide if you're not being funded by Qatar, obviously?
Yes, or Cuba or Iran. Every day they pick a new evildoer who's funded this. When the Wall Street Journal came with Cuba's behind, I'm like, okay, you guys really are scraping the barrel. But he didn't have a legal basis to be doing this. And what he looked at was, he said, I'm going to use immigration law. And part of the reason why Hoover liked immigration law so much was because it was outside the normal court system. Mm-hmm. And Hoover's belief was that you had no constitutional rights in immigration proceedings. So there's something at the time called the Anarchist Exclusion Act that allows someone to be thrown out the country being an anarchist. And Hoover raids, originally it's the Russian Workers' Union, later it's various communist parties, because there were two communist parties who could not get along with each other. I'm sure we're so shocked that the communists could not find themselves in one party for differences that none of us can understand either now or then. And they do these really abusive raids. They get, at the time, immigration enforcement through the Department of Labor. And in some of these situations, they raid headquarters and arrest everyone. And they get warrants via telegram. They telegram the names of the people after they've been arrested. In other cases, I've heard they use John Doe warrants, just a warrant for no one. And they arrest these people. They subject them to conditions that are tantamount to torture. And it's considered a really ugly stain on our history. Whenever you're nominated for the FBI director, Emma, they're always going to ask you, has the FBI ever done anything wrong? And the answer is always the Palmer raids and King. That's how bad it is. And it's eventually ended because Hoover has no deportation authority. And the new Secretary of Labor comes in and says, you guys have to stop doing this. This is ridiculous. And Hoover immediately concludes, logically, of course, the Secretary of Labor in the Wilson administration is a secret wobbly. Because who else? But what's so important to note about this is that he loses his intelligence division for about a decade, but he brings it back, and this is the same division that carries out 10-year interregnum, 10-year intermedium, right? That carries out COINTELPRO, spies on King, and that really for Hoover, immigration law was a pretext for political policing. He lacked the other authorities at that time to do so. And when he expanded into broad-based surveillance of what he called subversives, he moved beyond it. And I think today's attacks on these student protesters who are non-citizens absolutely are following the Hoover playbook. A lot of this comes from the Heritage Foundation, who has played a very long role in formulating U.S. national security policy going back to the Reagan administration. And, they come up with the idea of going after visa holders, but they're very clear. Their ultimate goal is they want to come after citizens. They want to make supporting Palestine akin to material support for terrorism. And obviously, we should not be attacking immigrants. Obviously, we should not be deporting people on the basis of their speech. But if you believe for a second this will stay limited to non-citizen holders if it's not opposed, just look at how Hoover used the Palmer raids to launch his horrifying semi-totalitarian intelligence apparatus that still haunts us to this day to a certain extent.
Yeah, well, can you expand a little bit on how these systems of suppression, surveillance, and criminalization of speech shifted within federal law enforcement, say from focusing on communist subversion, the threat from within, to a counterterrorism effort to suppress, but they're basically similar systems. It's just more about terrorism versus maybe explicitly saying we're going after communist subversion.
Well, I'm writing an entire book on this subject that will be out from Verso in 2026. It's called The Imperial Bureau. But no, you're correct. The original sort of apparatus that Hoover built was based on what's called a counter-subversive belief. And it's very rooted in late 19th century, early 20th century beliefs that we should spy on anarchist, communist, socialist. During the Cold War period, he's able to sort of elevate it to a foreign policy. He's able to use the foreign policy concerns with communism to sort of elevate his surveillance apparatus to that level. But in the mid-70s, there's an attack on the surveillance, on the CIA covert actions, on war in Vietnam, and almost instantly in the mid-70s, and you'll see people talking about this, and I think it was Counterspy magazine, they shift from talking about communism to terrorism. And one of the dissenting opinions in the Church Committee from Barry Goldwater, this is mid-70s, says these reforms will prevent us from tackling terrorism. And then the Heritage Foundation arrives on the scene, and they get Samuel T. Francis, who was later fired from the Washington Times in 1995 for being racist. How you're too racist for the Washington Times in 1995, I don't know. And a former House Un-American Activities Committee member, and they write this ridiculous white paper called The Coming Threat of Terrorism. If we don't do something about terrorism, we'll end up like Rhodesia, an apartheid state, which is an interesting comparison. And they go through all of the reasons we're threatened by terrorism. The FBI had to end its 26-year investigation of the Socialist Workers' Party. The Subversive Activities Control Board no longer exists anymore. Police red squads no longer keep lists of communists. And so all of the anti-communism stuff we're now being told is about terrorism. And the Reagan administration plays into this. And in the early 80s, there's a terrorism subcommittee that is absolutely key to the sort of rebranding of political policing for communism as being about anti-terrorism. The Nation magazine and places like that are writing in the 80s. They're bringing back McCarthy. This is decades for 9/11. They're bringing back McCarthyism under the guise of counterterrorism. And the big thing they wanted to do to sort of bring back the Hoover policies, as far as they ever went away, and in my research, they really never did, was this argument that we have to do preventative surveillance. We have to spy on people before they become terrorists. And the way you do that is looking at the same people you always look at. And after 9/11, that became the official position of the FBI. The FBI was no longer going to use law enforcement to prosecute terrorists. They were going to use intelligence to prevent terrorism before it happened and proactively go out and find them. And, part of the FBI guidelines now are that FBI agents have to engage in proactively finding terrorism. And in order to do that, they're allowed to open investigations into American citizens called assessments with no factual basis to believe that person has committed a crime or threatens national security. And of course, the FBI defines terrorism in ideological terms. The terrorism categories are anarchist extremist, Puerto Rican extremist, Black extremist. So if you're trying to find an anarchist extremist before he becomes a terrorist, you look for an anarchist or a Puerto Rican or a Black person who doesn't want to be killed by the police. It's fascinating, right? Whenever Black Americans don't want to be lynched or murdered by police, we treat that as some sort of national security problem, as opposed to just stop killing people.
Well, I mean, we have the reporting from Trevor Aronson, and we had him on the show about how it's been documented that the FBI infiltrated Black Lives Matter protests via this, shady character in the instance that he kind of highlighted as well. But I mean, bringing it back to the terrorism piece, because I think it's just so important to nail this down here. The fact that it went, the turn maybe happened on terrorism earlier than I thought, right? I would have said that this is when it's kind of like formalized in the post 9/11 war on terror era. But is it your contention that it kind of just more expanded and exploded, and perhaps the surveillance technology to deploy these tactics, that it just kind of grew out of, was an outgrowth of the war on terror, and was less like it didn't begin basically under Bush?
No, it didn't begin under Bush. I mean, I have documents that I got through a lawsuit that show what the FBI were doing right before 9/11. They're spying on World Bank protesters, right? The same JTTF, Joint Terrorism Task Force, that are going to be investigating the Pentagon plane and the Twin Towers are spying on World Bank protesters. And what my contention is that there was a very deliberate project. And again, you can go back and read what they were saying in The Nation and elsewhere in the 70s and 80s to rebrand counter-subversion, McCarthyism, anti-communism, counterterrorism, and 9/11 really escalates that project. I think the analogy would be the Iraq War. Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. Clinton was bombing them once every 3 days. They were being sanctioned. You had all of these people sort of advocating for bombing Iraq and going in there. And after 9/11, they were able to sort of use that to make that the policy. So the lie we were told after 9/11 is that the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, et cetera, couldn't stop the attacks because of the church committee restrictions, the protections of civil liberties. And that narrative, even though I have files that show them taking pictures of everyone who attended a college meeting about the World Bank and identifying them. And if you can do that, you can certainly find Al-Qaeda. I think so, right? You have the authority to do so. That became the official narrative. And then
which is quite convenient given what we know that basically Bush hand waved away in the months leading up to the attack because of his own incompetence. Then the answer is just more surveillance, which is what they always wanted, and invading Iraq, which is what Cheney always wanted to do anyway.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
And the thing with surveillance is every time it fails, they get more powers. And I mean, the surveillance fails to prevent terrorism for two reasons. First of all, is incompetence. Yeah. They're not very good at looking at terrorism. The second reason is, I think, political bias and purpose. I mean, if you have people from Al-Qaeda in the country plotting 9/11, and you're too busy looking for Quakers who might do a sit-in about Mumia Abu-Jamal, right, which is your priority? If you pick the second one as your priority, that's a problem. But I also think the problem goes back to the fact that the preventative policing mindset that they embrace is a project for political surveillance. It's not a project for keeping us safe. So FBI surveillance is very good at finding Quakers. It's very good at spying on Black Lives Matter. It's not very good at stopping terrorism. It's not very good at stopping spies. And the reason why is it's designed for the first purpose, not the second one. But no one ever talks about that.
Right. And just to bring it kind of full circle back to, we started talking about Zoran Mamdani, the threats against him, but this is not hypothetical for many people in this country. I mean, we have obviously Mahmoud Khalil, who missed the birth of his child because he was locked up for months over his political speech. You've written about him fairly extensively. Can you speak about that case and its role in this like overall mosaic of suppression of free speech under the guise of counterterrorism, et cetera?
Yeah, Mahmoud Khalil is a Columbia graduate student and a green card holder who was arrested and detained initially under a determination by Rubio that his presence in this country posed a threat to U.S. foreign policy or consequences for U.S. foreign policy. He's one of several non-citizens, including Ramessa Ozturk, Moshe Madali, and Batar Kansori, who have been subjected to similar treatment or similar persecution. He's sort of come to symbolize the Trump administration's ideological deportation policies and the way that Eugene Debs sort of came to symbolize the abuse of the Espionage Act during World War I. But there's other individuals as well. And what we know is that Trump campaigned on deporting student visa holders who weren't sufficiently enthusiastic about Israel's genocide. Oh, who can believe such people can exist? And in this sort of lame duck period of the Biden administration, these far-right groups like Batar start boasting that they are preparing dossiers, including using face recognition technology. Then Trump comes into office. He signs a series of executive orders clearly aimed at removing individuals from the country who support Palestinian rights, as well as creating this vast social media surveillance apparatus, again, aimed at non-citizens. But once we start spying on people on social media for their political views, I don't think it ends with non-citizens. And then we start to see these arrests, Khalil, Ozturk, Madali, Kansori, and they're all initially brought under this Rubio determination. And it's very interesting because it's a Cold War era law, and it allows the Secretary of State to throw someone out of the country if they make a determination they have consequences, adverse consequences for U.S. foreign policy. And thanks to a Bill Clinton era ruling of the Board of Immigration Appeals, once the Secretary of State signs that piece of paper, an immigration judge has to rule that person removable. There is no defense. Immigration courts aren't real courts. They work for Pam Bondi, or the Attorney General, who is right now Pam Bondi. And over the years, people have tried to challenge these sorts of immigration enforcement proceedings in federal courts, and Congress has responded by stripping the courts of a lot of their jurisdiction. But what Khalil, Ozturk, Madali, and others have done is to file federal habeas petitions, and these sort of are challenges to their detention, but they allow them to challenge the constitutionality of the order. So you basically have these systems where you have one proceeding going on in immigration court and one proceeding going on in federal court, and they can be quite contradictory. For example, a immigration judge refused to grant Ozturk, who is accused of writing an op-ed, terrible crime, writing an op-ed,
right.
Refused to grant her bail, but a federal judge did grant her bail. So it gets like this sort of weird legal whiplash that's hard to follow. But in Khalil's case, the immigration judge, who works for Pam Bondi and previously was an ICE lawyer, real neutral party, ruled he was removable. They went to a federal habeas, they filed a federal habeas court petition, which is in New Jersey, asking to prevent Rubio from making the foreign policy determination, from stopping the Trump administration from enforcing the policy of arresting, detaining, and removing non-citizens who criticize Israel. And the judge gave them a partial victory, stating that he could not be detained based on the Rubio determination. The Trump administration then turned around and said, actually, now we're detaining him on the basis that he refused to tell the immigration officer he was a member of a student group at Columbia. Again, real serious crime here, student clubs at Columbia, or had an internship at the United Nations Refugee for Palestine program. And the judge eventually releases him, but both the habeas petition hearings in New Jersey and the immigration hearings are ongoing in their separate sort of court systems. And there's a fight right now about whether or not the injunction that says he can't be removed on the Ruba determination means they have to stop the immigration proceedings to remove him for doing so. And the immigration judge is totally interested in continuing on these unconstitutional proceedings. And the other interesting thing is, when they slap down the foreign policy grounds, the Trump administration always runs and says, oh, but there's this second charge of him not telling the immigration officers about his student club activities or internships. The immigration judge has made no ruling on that. She's refused to hear evidence countering it or offering him relief from it on the basis that the sole reason for her finding of removability is the Rubio foreign policy determination, which is just an incredibly Kafkaesque proceeding. We bring two charges against you, one of which is unconstitutional and not permissible. And, but we base it off of that one. Therefore, you can't challenge the evidence under the second one. And when we can't get away with it under the first one, we go for the second one, but you can't challenge that one because we're doing the first one. Right? It makes no sense. It's just, it's Kafkaesque.
Well,
Kafka
I mean,
it's
it's also just, I think, notable that the Department of Homeland Security was created after 9/11. ICE was created after 9/11. And that perhaps in terms of what accelerated this kind of level of just straight up fascism, honestly, is that merging of that kind of nebulous immigration those nebulous immigration proceedings with like the nature of Homeland Security, right? So it exploits this broken court system, if you can even call it that, in order to suppress free speech under the guise of national security. It's operating outside of our constitutional protections in almost every conceivable way.
Yeah, I mean, and there's a long march to the sort of national securitization of immigration law. Initially, when Hoover did the Palmer raids, immigration was the authority of the Department of Labor. And because they wanted to make it more what we would now call national security focused, they moved it to the Department of Justice in 1940. And then that gets a lot of bad things going. And the Reagan administration creates this committee called the Alien Border Committee that brings what was then the INS, I think that was a precursor to ICE, CIA and FBI together, and announces that immigration enforcement is now the front line of terrorism enforcement. And the people who worked in immigration enforcement were very surprised to learn this. And then, after 9/11, we put the final nail in the coffin and we put it in this new thing called DHS, this new thing called Homeland Security, which sounds a lot like the fatherland. I don't know who picked that term. It was not a good one. But yeah, no, there is a long march of sort of first using immigration authorities because of their low constitutional protections to attack political speech, and then increasingly putting immigration authorities in the national security realm in order to further expand the use of this.
Well, Chip Gibbons, really, really fascinating stuff. People should check out Defending Rights and Dissent, and also all your pieces in Jacobin. We will put a link to that in the description down below, and wherever people are listening to or watching this. Chip, thanks so much for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.